Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The hidden pull toward destruction. There is a peculiar and deeply unsettling realization that arises when we begin to look honestly at human behavior. Beneath our ambitions, our habits, and even our moral choices, there seems to be a quiet, invisible longing for self-destruction. Not the dramatic, conscious decision to end one's life, but something subtler, an unconscious drift toward pain, collapse, and loss. It is a kind of gravitational pull toward our own undoing. Sigmund Freud called this force Thanatos, the death drive. Before Freud, most of psychology operated on what he named the pleasure principle. It was a clean, elegant idea: human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. It explained almost everything: why a child cries for comfort, why an adult works for success, why we chase love, warmth, or security. Pleasure restores equilibrium, pain disrupts it. We are designed, Freud said, to discharge tension and return to balance. Within this model, suffering was merely an error in the system, a flaw to be corrected. For a time, this idea seemed sufficient. It was logical, comforting, even hopeful. If pain was only a malfunction, then life could be fixed by removing what hurts. Yet Freud, in his clinical practice, began to notice phenomena that could not be explained by such simplicity. Patients who appeared to sabotage their own happiness. Soldiers who relived their traumas night after night. Lovers who returned to partners who destroyed them. Individuals who fell ill just as life began to improve. Over and over again, he saw pain reappear not as an accident but as a pattern, precise, deliberate, hauntingly familiar. These were not the actions of people seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. Something deeper and darker was at work. Freud began to ask a radical question: what if the human mind does not seek only to live? What if, beneath the surface, there exists a hidden drive to return to the stillness that preceded life itself? This hypothesis overturned the optimism of his earlier model. If there is indeed a death drive, then suffering is not merely a mistake but an expression, a coded language through which the psyche moves toward an unconscious goal. Freud suggested that all life contains within it the seed of its own undoing. Every cell that grows is also destined to decay. Every instinct to love is shadowed by an impulse to destroy. Beneath our vitality lies a silent wish to return to the peace of non-existence, to the inorganic state from which life once emerged. It was an idea that made even Freud uneasy. The death drive seemed to contradict the very principle of survival. Yet the evidence of it was everywhere. People repeated destructive relationships as if compelled by fate. They found new ways to re-experience old wounds. They destroyed what they built and betrayed what they loved. And each time they did so, it was not out of logic or will, but out of something unspoken, a pattern beyond reason, a rhythm older than consciousness itself. This does not mean that people consciously want to suffer. On the contrary, no one wakes up and chooses pain. But Freud observed that there are forces within the mind that operate beyond choice, ancient, silent, mechanical. They drive us toward repetition, toward familiar misery, even as we believe we are seeking change. What the conscious mind calls bad luck or self-sabotage may in fact be the death drive expressing itself through behavior, emotion, and thought. Such a theory is not comforting. It strips away the illusion that human beings are rational creatures steadily moving toward progress. It reveals us instead as beings divided, driven both by Eros, the instinct to create and preserve life, and by Thanatos, the urge to dissolve it. These two forces are locked in perpetual tension, each defining the other. Life, then, is not merely about pursuing pleasure but about negotiating this invisible war between construction and destruction. Love and loss, birth and decay. The death drive manifests in countless subtle ways: the artist who destroys their masterpiece before finishing it, the professional who ruins success with one reckless act, the lover who repeats abandonment despite longing for stability. These are not random failures. They are unconscious repetitions, symbolic returns to the void. Freud's insight was brutal yet clarifying. Within us exists a force that does not seek fulfillment but silence, not harmony but cessation. To acknowledge this is not to romanticize suffering, but to understand its structure. What is not understood repeats itself. What remains unconscious returns in disguise, as symptom, as crisis, as fate. By daring to name this inner drive toward destruction, Freud forced psychology to confront the darker truth of being human, that life itself contains an echo of death, that creation cannot exist without the constant temptation to undo it. The recognition of this hidden pull is the beginning of awareness. For only by looking directly at what threatens us from within can we hope to free ourselves from it. The death drive may never be erased, but by understanding its language, we begin to loosen its grip, to turn repetition into reflection, and fate into choice. Beyond pleasure, the birth of the death drive. For much of his early career, Freud believed the human mind was a delicate system balanced between two forces, the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The first sought immediate relief, release, and comfort. The second restrained it, teaching patience, discipline, and survival within society's limits. Together, they explained nearly everything: why a hungry child cries, why adults work, dream, and plan. The psyche seemed governed by the simple rhythm of tension and satisfaction, pain and pleasure. But Freud's careful observations began to disturb that neat order. In his consulting room, he encountered men and women who, by all rational measure, should have improved. They had insight, treatment, opportunity, yet they repeatedly collapsed at the threshold of healing. One patient would destroy her progress with a single impulsive act. Another, freed from trauma, would suddenly relapse into despair. Soldiers returned from war tormented by dreams that forced them to relive the same horror night after night. These were not random setbacks. They formed a pattern, an insistent repetition of pain without purpose or reward. Freud's early model could not explain this. The pleasure principle dictated that we move away from suffering, not circle endlessly around it. The reality principle taught us to endure temporary discomfort only in pursuit of greater well-being. Yet these patients sought neither pleasure nor adaptation, they reenacted loss. They seemed drawn to the wound itself, compelled to revisit the very moment that broke them. Something in them refused the movement toward life. This was the beginning of Freud's most radical idea, that perhaps the mind does not only seek pleasure, but also its own undoing. He proposed that beneath the familiar drives of hunger, desire, and survival lies a more primitive force, silent, unrelenting, and entirely irrational. This force, he argued, pushes the organism toward the inorganic state, a return to the stillness before life began. He called it Thanatos, the death drive. The implications were enormous. If true, this meant that human beings are not solely motivated by the wish to live, grow, or reproduce. We also carry within us a secret longing for dissolution, a gravitational pull back to nothingness. Freud saw evidence of this everywhere, in the child who drops and retrieves the same toy again and again as if rehearsing loss, in the addict who seeks destruction disguised as pleasure, in the artist who ruins their own creation at its moment of perfection. These acts, he believed, were the psyche's indirect expressions of the death drive, life's constant flirtation with its own extinction. It is tempting to reject such an idea. It offends our faith in progress and our moral intuitions about hope. Yet Freud was not moralizing, he was describing what he saw. The death drive, he argued, is not evil, it is elemental. It exists in everything that lives, an echo of matter's desire to return to equilibrium. Life itself is a temporary disturbance in the universe's calm. The death drive simply restores that calm. But human beings complicate this natural process. We build civilizations, moral codes, and art, ways to sublimate or disguise this internal conflict. Eros, the life drive, binds and creates. Thanatos unbinds and destroys. Together they weave the fabric of existence. Every act of love carries within it a hint of annihilation, for to love is to risk loss, to merge, to dissolve boundaries. Every creative impulse carries the shadow of decay, for what is built must someday fall. Freud's insight was not that life is doomed, but that life and death are twin threads of the same fabric, perpetually entwined. He saw that the death drive is most visible not in violence but in repetition. It does not always roar, it often whispers. It lures us into cycles that mirror our deepest wounds, into choices that feel inevitable. We destroy what sustains us because destruction, paradoxically, feels familiar. It reminds the psyche of its origin, the stillness before pain, before striving, before consciousness. This revelation did not make Freud cynical. It made him precise. He understood that human beings are not merely rational or moral creatures, we are organisms torn between the desire to continue and the temptation to cease. The death drive is the dark current beneath every attempt at renewal. And yet, by naming it, Freud gave humanity something extraordinary, a mirror. For when we recognize this drive within ourselves, we begin to see how much of our suffering is not random, not meaningless, but structured, even purposeful in its repetition. Thus, the death drive is not only a force of destruction but also a teacher. It exposes the limits of pleasure, the illusions of control, the fragility of our striving. It reminds us that every act of creation is an act of defiance against the void, and that perhaps what gives life its intensity is precisely this silent opposition between the will to exist and the wish to rest. The repetition of pain. At first glance, repeating experiences that have already caused suffering seems irrational. Why would anyone return to the same pain that once shattered them? Yet Freud discovered that the psyche has its own peculiar logic, a language written not in words but in actions, reenactments, and choices that defy common sense. What we call mistakes or bad luck may in fact be the mind's way of expressing something unresolved. It is not forgetfulness that brings us back to pain, but remembrance, a need, hidden from consciousness, to relive what was never fully understood. Freud called this force the compulsion to repeat. It is one of the most haunting and mysterious mechanisms of the unconscious. Rather than learning from the past and moving forward, the psyche often recreates the past in an endless loop. It summons familiar suffering as if the only way to master trauma is to vestige it. Like a play performed night after night, the same emotional scenes are replayed with different actors, different settings, but the same ending. The individual believes they are making new choices, yet the outcome remains eerily identical: heartbreak, sabotage, loss, failure. Why does this happen? Freud's answer was both elegant and unsettling: the unconscious is timeless. It does not recognize past, present, or future, it only recognizes patterns. A wound that was never integrated remains alive, frozen in psychic time. The mind cannot let it go, because the event was never truly felt through. It was too painful, too overwhelming, too chaotic to be processed when it occurred. So the psyche does the only thing it knows how to do: it tries again. It repeats, hoping unconsciously that this time the story will end differently. But the outcome rarely changes, because the person does not know they are reenacting. The child who once felt abandoned may grow into an adult who repeatedly chooses unavailable partners, unconsciously seeking to rewrite the original story. This time, they'll stay. The professional who once felt unseen by a parent may sabotage every promotion that threatens to bring visibility, repeating the childhood equation between success and rejection. The addict, relapsing again and again, may be trying to master the terror of powerlessness through repetition of the very thing that destroys them. The tragedy is that these reenactments do not bring relief. They intensify the suffering they were meant to resolve. Yet the compulsion persists, because it is not governed by reason but by an emotional necessity to make the unbearable bearable. Repetition is the mind's crude attempt at healing, a rehearsal of pain disguised as destiny. Freud noticed that repetition often carries an undercurrent of guilt. Many people, he observed, seem to inflict punishment upon themselves as though paying a mysterious debt. Success, happiness, or love provoked an inner alarm, triggering acts of self-sabotage. Beneath the surface, guilt whispered, "You do not deserve this. You must suffer to balance the scales." In this sense, repetition becomes not only an attempt to master trauma but a form of unconscious atonement. The psyche clings to pain as if it were justice. This internal cycle can be devastatingly persistent. People find themselves trapped in the same emotional patterns for decades, confusing familiarity with fate. They call it "my luck," "my type," "my curse," unaware that it is the mind's theater repeating its most painful scene. Each new iteration feels slightly different, yet the ending is the same heartbreak, the same disappointment, the same collapse. The unconscious does not evolve through time, it evolves through awareness. Until the original wound is brought into consciousness and symbolized, that is, given meaning, it will demand to be relived. This is why therapy, analysis, or even deep introspection can feel like walking into a storm. It is not merely about understanding the past intellectually but about feeling it fully, for the first time, in the safety of the present. When the frozen emotion is finally experienced and named, the cycle begins to loosen. Repetition loses its grip because the message has been heard. But many resist this work. To face the original wound is to relive vulnerability, helplessness, fear, all that the ego was built to avoid. So the psyche takes the longer route, reenacting instead of remembering. It is safer to live the pain symbolically than to feel it directly. And thus the wheel turns. Freud once remarked that, what is not remembered is repeated. The mind, left unilluminated, continues to perform its ancient rituals of suffering. Yet within this grim mechanism lies a hidden invitation. Every repetition is a call from the unconscious, asking to be understood. The pain that recurs is not meaningless, it is a message encoded in experience. To break the cycle, one must not run from the repetition but interpret it. Ask, what is this pain trying to reveal? What am I repeating, and why? Only through this confrontation can we transform compulsion into consciousness, punishment into understanding, and fate into freedom. Addiction to suffering. There comes a point in the cycle of repetition where pain no longer feels like an intruder. It becomes a companion, something known, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Freud observed that many people do not merely experience suffering, they inhabit it. Over time, the psyche can grow dependent on pain, not because it is pleasurable, but because it provides identity. This phenomenon, the addiction to suffering, is one of the most subtle and dangerous psychological structures that can exist within a human life. When we think of addiction, we imagine choice, someone returning to a substance or behavior despite knowing the harm it brings. But the addiction to suffering is not a conscious choice. It is an unconscious loyalty to pain, built slowly, over years of repetition. The individual does not crave the suffering itself but the stability it offers. Within pain, there is no uncertainty. The ache is constant, familiar, reliable. Happiness, on the other hand, is unpredictable. It demands trust, openness, vulnerability. For many, that is far more frightening than anguish. Freud noticed that the ego, our sense of I, is often constructed around early experiences of pain. A child who grows up in an environment of chaos, neglect, or conditional love learns a grim equation: to be seen, one must suffer. Love is earned through sacrifice. Attention arrives through distress. Safety comes only when one submits to control. Over time, these lessons solidify into an emotional blueprint. As the child matures, they unconsciously seek relationships and situations that mirror the emotional climate of their early life. Suffering becomes the proof of existence: I hurt, therefore I am. To the outside world, this might look like weakness or self-sabotage. But for the psyche, it is survival logic. Pain is familiar, peace is alien. The person who has only known conditional affection will often feel uneasy when loved freely. The one who grew up in emotional chaos will unconsciously recreate chaos whenever calm threatens to take hold. It is not comfort they fear losing, it is identity. Without their suffering, they no longer recognize themselves. This is why people often relapse into destructive patterns precisely when their lives begin to improve. It is not because they lack discipline or intelligence, it is because their unconscious reads happiness as danger. The mind resists unfamiliar peace as though it were a void. Pain, though unbearable, feels like home. In this way, suffering ceases to be an emotion and becomes a habitat, a psychic geography in which the ego knows its place. Freud described the neurotic's dilemma as an indecision between pleasure and punishment. Within this conflict lies a haunting paradox: a genuine desire for happiness coexists with a deep belief that one does not deserve it. Success provokes guilt, joy feels fraudulent, love awakens suspicion. The psyche resolves this tension by re-establishing pain, restoring the old emotional balance, the only one it truly knows. The suffering, in this sense, becomes an act of unconscious justice, a way of paying an invisible debt. This inner dynamic explains why so many people speak of feeling drawn to what harms them. The pull is not attraction, it is recognition. The familiar pattern whispers, "This feels like me." Breaking free from it feels like betrayal, as though one were abandoning not just the pain but the entire story of who they have been. For someone whose self-image was forged in adversity, healing can feel like death. To loosen this bond, Freud proposed the process of elaboration, the act of bringing the unconscious into awareness, of transforming raw pain into meaning. The goal is not to erase suffering but to understand its architecture. When pain is understood, it no longer defines identity, it becomes experience. The wound ceases to be a home and becomes a teacher. But this process is neither easy nor immediate. It requires the courage to ask terrifying questions: who am I without my pain? What remains of me when I no longer need to suffer to feel alive? These questions threaten the ego because they dismantle the foundation upon which it stands. Yet they are the only doorway to freedom. For once pain is seen for what it is, not punishment, not destiny, but memory, its grip weakens. The addiction falters. The individual begins to see that they were never meant to live inside their wound, only to understand it. And from that understanding arises the possibility of something entirely new, a self no longer organized around suffering but around awareness. This transformation marks the beginning of liberation. To outgrow pain is to outgrow the false self that pain created. It is to step into an identity that is not born of what was endured but of what was learned. And that, Freud believed, is the first act of true healing, not the end of suffering, but the end of belonging to it. Making the unconscious conscious. When Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he did not offer comfort, he offered clarity. His goal was never to promise a painless life, but to reveal the hidden machinery of the mind, to show that what we call fate often arises from within us. He understood that freedom is not found in denying our darkness, but in naming it. The unconscious rules silently, but its reign weakens the moment its language is understood. To make the unconscious conscious, that, Freud said, is the foundation of all liberation. It is tempting to believe that insight alone can save us. That if we simply understand our patterns, they will dissolve. But Freud knew this was only the first step. The unconscious does not respond to reason or positivity. It does not vanish because we wish it to. It must be worked through, symbolized, and felt. The material of the unconscious, the guilt, the repetition, the death drive, cannot be erased, but it can be transformed. Its energy can be redirected from destruction to creation, from compulsion to awareness. The analytical process, in this sense, is an act of excavation. It asks us to descend into the hidden caverns of the psyche and uncover the forces that shape us, not to judge them, but to understand their necessity. For every destructive impulse once served a purpose. The person who learned to control everything may have once lived in chaos. The one who repeats abandonment may have been taught that loss is the price of love. The mind, in its own strange way, protects us, even through pain. Making the unconscious conscious is therefore not a war against the self, but a reconciliation with it. Freud compared this process to mourning. In grief, we gradually accept that what we loved has been lost, and by doing so, we regain the capacity to love again. The same principle applies to psychological work. We must grieve the illusions that kept us trapped. We must mourn the identity built on suffering, the stories that no longer serve us, the loyalties to pain that once defined who we were. Only then can new psychic space emerge. But this new space, this inner emptiness, can be terrifying. Many people, upon releasing old patterns, find themselves adrift. The silence that follows the end of suffering feels unbearable. After years of being organized around struggle, the absence of pain can seem like a void. Some even rush back into chaos simply because the peace feels alien. Freud understood this paradox well. When suffering is removed from the center of identity, he wrote, a space emerges, and that space is the beginning of freedom. To inhabit that freedom requires courage, the courage to face life without the familiar crutches of repetition, guilt, and control. The courage to live consciously. When the unconscious no longer dictates behavior from the shadows, we gain what Freud called maneuvering room. We begin to act, rather than react. The cycle of compulsion transforms into the capacity for choice. What was once a symptom becomes a story, what was once punishment becomes knowledge. Yet this transformation is not achieved through intellect alone. It is a work of patience, the slow cultivation of awareness through reflection, honesty, and the willingness to feel what was once avoided. Freud described it as psychic work, the most demanding and most human labor there is. It is the task of turning suffering into meaning, of translating chaos into coherence. At the heart of this process lies a single idea, that we are not prisoners of our unconscious, but its stewards. The death drive, the repetition, the addiction to suffering, these are not curses, but messages. They speak in the only language they know, repeating until we listen. And once we begin to understand, repetition loses its necessity. Pain no longer needs to scream when it can be spoken. To make the unconscious conscious is to step into authorship, to become the writer of one's own narrative rather than a character bound by inherited scripts. It does not mean we will never suffer again. It means that our suffering will no longer be senseless. It will have form, context, and direction. It will be a chapter, not a destiny. Freud's final hope was modest yet profound, that through lucidity, human beings might learn to bear existence with a little more grace, a little more truth. Where the ID was, he said, the ego must come to be. In those few words lies the essence of psychological growth, to bring light where there was darkness, meaning where there was compulsion, and freedom where there was fate. And perhaps that is what it truly means to live, not to escape our suffering, but to understand it so completely that it can no longer rule us.